Airing first on Asheville FM, WSFM LP 103.3 in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian radio show broadcasting out of occupied Salagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world. Rik Scarce is the author of the 1990 exploration of the Earth liberation and defense movements and folks involved called Eco Warriors, Understanding the Radical Environmental Movement, which is still considered required reading in understanding radical eco-defense. At one point, he served 159 days in Spokane jail for refusing to testify about his sources in his research on the animal liberation movement. Leslie James Pickering, co-owner of Burning Books in Buffalo, New York, is an author, activist, and former spokesperson for the North American Animal Liberation Front press office. The following is a recording from November 2017 at Burning Books in Buffalo, New York, of a conversation between Scarce and Pickering about property destruction, terrorism labels, and radical ecological movement. This conversation feels important to air as we stand at the crossroads here in the U.S. between the pandemic, an uprising to challenge police killings primarily of black and brown bodies, and what role, if any, the police should fill in our society, the collapse of the economy, the continued rise of political fascism, the deplatforming of racist statues, further internalization of the border and its logic, and global climate chaos that will likely make human life at this scale impossible. This power structure is amplifying difference and applying privileges and oppressions across that constructed spectrum, as it always has. But it is in its death throes, and thus is made visible in all of its ugliness. And its lashings are pretty damn extreme. For that reason, conversations about the serious needs to challenge basic assumptions and to work through hard ideas feel especially important to me. If you like what we do at The Final Straw, consider checking out other anarchist podcasts on the Channel Zero Network. You can see what we produce by checking out channelzeronetwork.com. Here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
How can we imagine a world beyond prisons and police, borders and surveillance?
Rust Belt Abolition Radio is an abolitionist media and movement-building project based in Detroit, Michigan.
Each monthly episode amplifies the voices of those impacted by mass incarceration and explores ongoing work in the movement to abolish the carceral state and racial capitalism.
Tune in to Rust Belt Abolition Radio here on the Channel Zero Network and visit www.rustbeltradio.org to learn more.
And now some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what? We'll call like a boss.
The strike for Black Lives is planned for July 20th. It's been organized by a national coalition of labor unions, including the Teamsters, American Federation of Teachers, the United Farm Workers, Si Se Puede, and the Fight for $15. Also involved in the organizing are racial and social justice groups like March On, Center for Popular Democracy, National Domestic Workers Alliance, and the Movement for Black Lives, which consists of roughly 150 organizations that collectively make up Black Lives Matter. This strike for Black Lives is planned in more than 25 cities involving fast food, nursing home, rideshare, and airport workers, among others. The workers intend to walk off the job for the day, and those who can't will stop working for 8 minutes, the length of time that a Minneapolis pig had his knee on the neck of George Floyd. There will be worker-led marches through major cities and, dare I dream, some really great potential for some cop cars getting tipped over and burned. Strikers for Black Lives are demanding radical changes by both government and capitalists to address the structural racism in the economy. Some statistics that I plagiarized from an AP article, and AP can suck it. 140 million Americans are affected by systemic poverty. 62 million American workers make less than a living wage. This includes 54% of black workers and 63% of Hispanic workers. So the structural racism is pretty glaring. The capitalists have their knees on a whole lot of necks. Economic violence, effectively and broadly, is choking more people than police violence. A quote from Ashley Woodard Henderson, a strike organizer with Movement for Black Lives, which I also poached from the AP article, and the AP can still suck it. Henderson said, "Corporate power is a threat to racial justice. And the only way to usher in a new economy is by tackling those forces that aren't fully committed to dismantling racism, unquote. In all of this, I'm reminded of two prior moments in history where workers and other segments of society formed a coalition to confront the capitalist disorder, and in both of those moments, the capitalists prevailed. One of them occurred during the Great Depression, and the other occurred during the 1960s. So if we look at the current events in the context of that continuum, we might think of this as a kind of cyclic thing that keeps popping up and then sputtering out. Hopefully, this time, it doesn't sputter out. During the Great Depression, the industrial workers of the world attempted to organize workers across the entire economic spectrum into one big union. The idea being, of course, that workers in all fields share a common struggle, just as fast food workers and Uber drivers do today. The strategy was to organize all the workers and then have the collective leverage to call the shots. FDR managed to unravel the plan by gathering together all the major industrialists and demanding that they each make concessions to smaller compartmentalized trade unions, like the Teamsters and the UAW. By doing this, FDR provided the workers their unions, but kept each of them sectionalized, so that if one group went on strike, production in all the other sectors of the economy could continue. As a consequence, for workers, even a win was a loss. Fast forward to the 1960s, and we saw a broad coalition of workers and labor unions joined by groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Southern Christian Leadership Council, and a veritable alphabet soup of civil rights groups, as well as Students for a Democratic Society and the Black Panthers. All of these groups coalesced around struggles for social, racial, and economic justice. A couple of things led to the unraveling of that broad coalition. First, it largely put its hopes in electoral solutions that were doomed, given the conservatism of the older generations not on the radical bandwagon. Second, COINTELPRO. The fascist police state did everything in its vast power to disrupt and atomize the various organizations in the coalition, turning them against one another and themselves. So, as a final result, the overwhelming police violence of the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, the subsequent conspiracy trials, and the election of Richard Nixon as a pro-war and law and order president pounded nails into the coffin of that movement. I would suggest that there are useful lessons of these historical examples that can benefit the movement for social, racial, and economic justice that is building now with the strike for Black Lives. First, trust no organizations, including unions. Organizations don't struggle. People do. Second, trust no politicians to be a magic bullet. As we learned in 1968, Bobby Kennedy is not going to save us. And we already know that Joe Biden is no Bobby Kennedy. Third, trust no government solution. You can bet that any reform or legislation undertaken to solve the problem will make the problem exponentially worse. I say all that not to be discouraging or demoralizing. I'm not saying you can't put your hope in anything. I'm saying you can only put your hope in one thing: us. We outnumber them. So, we simply struggle by every means necessary until we see with our own eyes the future we seek to manifest. We don't ask for permission from anyone or anything. We don't seek approval from anyone or anything. To the extent possible, we directly change the circumstances we can no longer tolerate. We kick the darkness until it bleeds daylight, and then we keep kicking. The past few weeks, a lot of statues have toppled. Some have gone into the river, but statues aren't the only things that can topple. Governments can, corporations, economies. Hopefully, July 20th will be a clear message to governments, to corporations, and to the economy. We outnumber you, and we're done. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain, an exile from Ohio at Buckingham Correctional in Dillwyn, Virginia. If you're striking on July 20th, You are the resistance.
You can write to Sean Swain at his latest address at Sean Swain, number 2015638, Buckingham Correctional, P.O. Box 430, Dillwyn, Virginia, 23936. You can find his past writings, recordings of his audio segments, and updates on his case at seanswain.org, or now follow him on Twitter at @SwainRocks.
So tonight's event is what we're calling an unstructured discussion on the topic of advancing Earth and animal liberation, a conversation on tactics. So discussing specifically the question of where we should draw the line on tactics and to what end. Two eminently qualified individuals to speak on this. We are very fortunate to have our very own Leslie Pickering, the former press office spokesperson for the ELF, and the author of multiple books on radical politics and specifically on the Earth and animal liberation movements, as well as broader liberation strategies. And Rik Scarce is a documentary filmmaker and a professor at Skidmore College, teaching in the areas of environmental history and sociology. His seminal book, Eco Warriors: Understanding the Radical Environmental Movement, was the first real treatment of the U.S. radical environmental movement and is a critical read for anyone interested in that area and topic. He brings more than 30 years of research and his own experiences as a scholar of the earth, and was jailed himself for refusing to testify in a grand jury hearing in which they were asking him to reveal his sources for some of his research. Spent 159 days in jail. So to give you an idea of the format for tonight, Rik will make some introductory comments, talk at length, however you want to set that tone, and then what we'll do is follow up with just a couple of short questions to sort of frame terms, get a sense that we're all on the same page in terms of concepts, and then broaden that out into a broader set of questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience after we've sort of covered a couple of different topics. So, Rik, the floor is yours.
Thanks. And thanks so much for having me here. I really do appreciate it. As I was driving over today, I was really quite excited about this event and incredibly anxious. Somehow or another, you all are making me feel very at ease, though, so I appreciate that. And I'll tell you about why the anxiety in just a second. It's probably related to what I'm going to say first, and that is that in the nearly 30 years, 27 years since Eco Warriors was published, I've never done an event at a radical progressive bookstore. Plenty of local bookstores, that kind of thing. But I've never been in a space like this to talk to people about my ideas, and presumably the people who populate these spaces are at least somewhat open to them. And so this is a really wonderful opportunity for me. So thanks to all of you for coming out. And again, thanks, Leslie, for giving me this wonderful opportunity. And Dave, thank you for helping make it possible in a really, really big way. So what's my motivation behind wanting, instead of sitting up here and giving a 45-minute presentation about the history of Earth First, the Earth Liberation Front, and the Animal Liberation Front, instead of doing something like that, why did I ask Dave and Leslie if it would be okay to have this conversation? In part, it's because there aren't any radical bookstores anywhere near me for me to sit down and have earnest conversations with authors when they come through, that kind of thing. So I don't have this community to bounce these ideas off of. My colleagues at Skidmore College are certainly wonderful, and plenty of them are pretty darn progressive, but they don't get a lot of, I think, what's going on in my head with regard to these very important issues. So that's really what spurred me to want to sit down here with you folks and to ultimately have a really open, genuine conversation among us. So that's kind of the background. Let me kind of state my case then, and then we'll get rolling as a result of that, I guess. So the argument that I want to make is that property destruction in most cases, and there are some important exceptions in my mind that we need to take into account, but property destruction in pursuit of, in particular, earth liberation, and to a large extent, I think animal liberation, sadly, as well, is mistaken. It's the wrong way to go about bringing social change. This is a debate I want to acknowledge at the very start for those of you who are familiar with the long-term history of ecological resistance movements. This is a debate that's been going on for a really, really long time. In 1987, when I opened up the first issue of the Earth First Journal, the tabloid-sized newspaper that they used to publish, I'm sure that there in the letters to the editor or in some op-ed column, somebody was ranting about the tension between monkey wrenching, property destruction on one hand, and civil disobedience on the other. And there may have even been an exchange. It doesn't seem like there were very many issues of the Earth First Journal back then where those kinds of debates, and quite often it ended up going into vitriol, weren't taking place. And whenever radical environmentalists got together and began discussing the future of the movement, these issues surfaced. So I absolutely know that there's a long history here, and I'm absolutely positive we're not going to solve the issue tonight, not at all. But I think the issue is still timely, and it's going to become more so. We're seeing more and more activism on behalf of the planet in North America and globally. It's an incredibly exciting development to see so many people willing in Vancouver, BC, to sit in the middle of a railroad and to stop tar sands trains loaded with that junk from getting to port, and what happened with Dakota Access and Keystone XL, and on and on and on. These are incredibly exciting things, and we're seeing more and more of it. You've got somebody of the standing of Bill McKibben encouraging people worldwide to commit acts of civil disobedience on behalf of the planet. It's a fantastic development, and in my mind, it won't be very long until we see more people moving into property destruction. I could be wrong about that. It could be a step too far for a whole lot of people, but it won't surprise me if the growing upswelling of civil disobedience doesn't shift to what is now called direct action, which in terms of vocabulary, I would suggest we use as a synonym for property destruction. So there's some background and acknowledgement of history and so forth. So now let me finally state my case, and it rests on sort of 4 points. Oh, one more thing real quickly. Yeah, and that's the real why I want to have this discussion. In part, yeah, it's been sitting with me for a long time and I wanted to. But here's the deal real quickly. There is not a single person who I speak with. It could be new family members. I remarried 10 years ago, and this conversation took place with them. It could be new faculty members who are on my campus and they ask me about my research. It could be people I meet on an airplane and presumably will never see again. And they ask what kind of things I do as a faculty member. And when I get around to telling them that I have done research on the quote-unquote radical environmental movement to a person, they look at me and say, "Oh, you mean the eco-terrorists." So let me use that as a springboard to the first of these 4 points that I want to make. I called this, I labeled what I had in mind this evening and the argument that I want to make a practical argument. I will have nothing to say if you want to take the conversation in the direction of philosophy or even theory. And I teach social theory, including a little bit of anarchist theory. I really don't want to go there. I want to talk about real world, on the ground problems, realities, and so forth here. That's my preference. So point number one, I'll call labeling. Radical environmentalism, resistance environmentalism, ecological resistors have been labeled successfully as terrorists. And there is no lower form of life to most people in the United States today than a terrorist. So the federal government has been amazingly successful in this effort. It was aided and abetted by things in the 80s and 90s when, with the emergence of the radical environmental movement, we found that conservative politicians inevitably put the word radical in front of environmentalist, no matter who they were talking about. So the radicals at the Sierra Club, right? You know, you would literally hear that kind of verbiage, right? And we still do today, except they don't even bother talking about environmentalists in the current situation. But that reality laid the groundwork for the labeling starting at least as far back as 2002, early in that year, when the FBI went before Congress and labeled radical environmentalists as the nation's #1 domestic terror threat. So we've got that phenomenon occurring at least that far back. So I think that label is a dangerous thing. Labels are sticky. They don't go away easily. And so this movement, regardless of whether one is completely committed to civil disobedience or completely committed to property destruction, this movement has successfully been labeled eco-terrorism, and that's very much in people's minds. So that's point number one. Point number two, ideology. The American ideology is such that private property, as we all know, is this sacred stuff, right? We've got books back here on the wall condemning that notion, and every anarchist and socialist communist thinker, right, begins with the dangers of private property when they think about what is wrong with the capitalist world. But the reality is, again, out there in the American populace, private property is sacred stuff. And you, regardless of whether it is your own or anyone else's, folks feel that if someone has come for anyone's private property, theirs is on the line. I think that's a big part of what's going on, again, with the American ideology, this belief system that people act upon. Then there is the problem of the successes that the government has had with jailing earth liberation and animal liberation activists. I would suggest that the activists who have been caught and have been jailed are probably the most committed, right? To be willing to commit serious crimes and look at monster jail time, and now that label terrorism, right? Daniel McGowan, whose photo is right over here, and the film about Daniel, there's a poster of it right up there if a tree falls. You know, Daniel McGowan will live the rest of his life with terrorist across his forehead. The most committed people are locked away, and you can't do very much at all when you're in prison. You might be able to write, right? If you're in a one of the serious, what does the C stand for in management unit? Communication. That's it. Sorry, I literally couldn't remember. Communication management units, right, are there in part to shut you off from the rest of the world, right? So if you're a terrorist, that's where you're going to be sent in prison, and you can't communicate. You can't help lead. And the L word, leadership, is a challenging one to use in the anarchist world, and I acknowledge that. But the fact is, the people who are out there who are talking to folks who have the potential to recruit them to the movement are, in fact, leaders. And when leaders are in prison, they can't do what we all need them to do, which is to help get us to a very, very different relationship with this planet. And then finally, and to some extent, I think, following from the leadership topic, because I just alluded to it, but I think to some extent this kind of stands independently on its own. the future of the movement is in question when people commit acts of civil disobedience, or commit acts of property destruction rather than civil disobedience, because as a function of folks being jailed, an assault on dominant ideology, not wanting to be associated with a quote-unquote terrorist group, folks are going to stay at home. They're not going to get involved in the movement, including on the civil disobedience side. Now, I've just contradicted myself a little bit because a moment ago I praised the spread of civil disobedience around the country. But I wonder if a whole lot more people wouldn't be showing up if it weren't for the stigma that unfortunately this movement has taken on thanks to property destruction. So I'll stop there. Those are my 4 key points, and I'd love to hear what Leslie has to say.
This is the Final Straw Radio. You're hearing a discussion about radical ecological action and property destruction between author and sociologist Rik Scarce and former press officer of the North American Earth Liberation Front press office and author Leslie James Pickering. This is recorded at Burning Books in Buffalo, New York. Check out more info on that bookstore at burningbooks.com.
Do you want to start with the response to those directly?
What do you think?
I think you should. But I'll leave it up to you.
Okay. I guess I'll try to go point by point as best I can remember. In terms of point number 1, labeling, right? The idea being that if we commit destructive acts as part of our movement, that we're going to be labeled terrorists in this case, right? But in the past, it's been Reds or savages. There's always some kind of boogeyman name for whoever it is that the enemy is. And in this case, terrorism has been so undefined. The definition of terrorism has been whittled down in recent years to be very malleable to whoever it is that you're against. And it is true that I'm labeled, and a lot of people that I've worked with are labeled eco-terrorist or some kind of terrorist or another. And I don't like it. I'm not really sure that anybody likes it. And maybe out of all the people I know, I like it the most. because it's kind of like, it's hilarious. Like when I first moved back to Buffalo, there was some kind of like stencil graffiti on the ground, and it said eco-terrorist with a question mark. And there was all of these other terms too, but there was one that said eco-terrorist. And I used to just laugh every time I passed by it, because it's like, what is that? It's like eco-terrorist kind of like softens up the terrorist thing. It's just weird and funny. But regardless, the point is that the labeling happens, and I guess what I have to say to that is that labeling happens to the most radical in the room at any given point throughout American history. And if people were to back down from taking action that they believe is the right thing to do because of an issue like labeling, that would be a shame. There's a lot of people in American history who, there's a lot of people in American history and world history who were labeled nasty things when they were out doing nasty things, right? And some of them have been vindicated throughout history. The Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman, or they're talking about putting Tubman on one of the bills. I think the $10 bill or something like that now. So Malcolm X eventually got on a stamp. It was controversial when I was young. He got put on a postage stamp, but Malcolm was vilified. Tubman, there was a death, a warrant out for her arrest and all that kind of stuff. So it's always going to be labeling. Labeling isn't something we can avoid. It's going to be the most radical person in the room, and whether that person is committing actual acts of violence or acts of property destruction, or if the movement is at a point where all you're doing is signing petitions, it's going to be the people with the most radical words on those petitions that get called terrorists or whatever. If we were to succumb to what our enemies call us and shape our strategies based on what our enemies identify us as, then we are defeated from the get-go. It's always a bad word. It's derogatory terms that were used for different groups of people throughout history, for different countries that this country was up against in war. They had terms for pretty much every enemy that there was ever. And so in a sense, it's a little bit of a badge of honor in a weird, ironic way to be that there is this thing called eco-terrorism, and it is this big focus of the FBI, which is an evil organization and a horrible history. And they've found what we're doing significant enough to prioritize us, which comes with a lot of really bad baggage. But on one hand, while the Earth Liberation Front was very active and while I was doing press work for them, in a weird, ironic way, it was reassuring, because I know that all the social justice movements that I've allied myself throughout history have been targets and #1 priorities of the FBI. And to have that happen with the ELF was, we must be doing something kind of right. Obviously, the journalists weren't in favor of us. The politicians weren't in favor of the movement. And that word never went away and is probably never really going to go away. But again, I would never suggest basing strategy on something like what nasty terms they're going to be calling us if we do things they don't like. And generally, they call us nasty terms because we're making an impact. So that's a thought I had on.
So the sacred ideology of private property?
Yeah, and one other quick thing. It's key to note that this movement, and I feel safe saying that every radical movement, it doesn't have the same priorities as the more moderate movements, right? And so looking really good and getting positive news coverage and getting every middle American to understand what you're doing isn't the main priority of the Earth Liberation Front. They realized that they would sacrifice some popularity and mainstream public appeal in order to do this extreme thing. Same thing with groups like the Black Panther Party and several other throughout American history. You know, you build a strategy and you choose one thing or another, and when you're part of the radical wing of a movement, being the most popular kid in school isn't your #1 priority. So you realize you're going to be called nasty names, and you accept that reality because you believe in what you're doing. So, ideology was the
Private property, yeah.
Yeah, private property is very sacred in American society. I couldn't disagree with that anymore. The main thing I have to think about that is that is really wrong. The concept of private property on this continent in particular has a big historical context, where this conquering colonialist society came in and imposed this idea of private property on the peoples that were living here. And, you know, I'd like to see it go away. I feel pretty safe saying that people involved in radical movements, especially the Earth Liberation Front, were and are working towards eliminating those kinds of ideas in our society. So, yes, it's going to turn people off if we attack their private property. I dealt with that personally on many occasions. There was a tree farm that got burnt down in Oregon. The Poplar Farm. It was an action of the Earth Liberation Front, and I met face to face with people who worked there and had to lose some time at work because the building had to be remade. When the Cavell West horse slaughterhouse was burnt down, it was slaughtering wild horses on public lands and selling the horse meat overseas. When the underground burned that down, I got a phone call from the owner of the company screaming at me at my house about how I burnt down when I didn't set the fire, but he was just saying I did anyway. But you know, I'm familiar with the concept of people being frustrated and angered and feeling like we did something that was really horrible when property was destroyed. I think that's kind of by design. Right? You're choosing to destroy property at this point or at any given point in the movement rather than doing something that's physically violent towards somebody as an individual. Property shouldn't be perceived as sacred. And in countries, even first world countries outside of the US, there's slightly different perceptions of property. You look at protests throughout Europe, and there's consistent property destruction of them decade after decade after decade. In the United States, we see it once in a while, and the anarchists are always pinned up as the horrible people who break windows. But, you know, almost every major protest in Europe has got property destruction, and I would like to see this sacred nature of property dismantled, and I think that's part of the bigger objective that these underground groups are trying to create.
So we'll go back to that because that's, I think, a central theme of some of your words. But I do want to hear you talk, before we move on, the third point, the success of jailing activists and what that means for the loss of movement leaders.
Well, first of all, people who come here a lot are pretty familiar with political prisoner issues. We deal a lot with political prisoners here. We work directly with several that are in New York State and several that are national. And I would disagree with the notion that you can't do or accomplish anything while in prison. And we can take Daniel McGowan, for example, because you brought him up. Oscar-nominated documentary came out while he was in prison, which he orchestrated. I can promise you that he wouldn't have been able to get an Oscar-nominated documentary produced on the Earth Liberation Front had he not been facing that jail time and had the situation not gotten that severe. We see people like Mumia Abu-Jamal, we see people like Nelson Mandela, and Leonard Peltier, who have accomplished, while they all should be free, please don't get me wrong, everyone should be free, but putting someone in prison doesn't eliminate them from part of our consciousness. And in fact, it draws us towards realizing that prison is an issue in itself. When people from the Earth Liberation Movement were sent to prison, it drew our movement directly towards recognizing all these other movements that had political prisoners too. All of a sudden, we weren't just looking at radical environmentalists and animal rights activists anymore, because they were alongside people from the Black liberation struggle who are still in prison from that time period. And it broadened our perspective and made us work directly with all these other political prisoners, because now we were working on political prisoner issues. It's not a good thing to be in prison, but it doesn't stop you. Same thing with getting killed. It's not a good thing to get killed for a movement, but it does not stop the movement. Sometimes it can be made to things like that can be made to draw more attention to the movement. I think it's key. We're kind of skirting around this bigger issue. It's key to understand that when a movement goes beyond civil disobedience, in particular towards property destruction or what might be considered violence, it's really no longer a reformist movement. It's not trying to make reform happen, right? The guy the director of If a Tree Falls, would always say at these interviews afterwards to me in private, like, I just don't think that sabotage is going to change government policy on environmentalism. And I couldn't agree more. Like, sabotage is not going to change government policy. It's not intended to, right? It's because you have a different philosophy you're enacting when you engage in underground struggle or guerrilla struggle or direct action or whatever you want to call it. You don't necessarily believe that policy change is possible, or that if it is possible, that it's effective. And you've taken up some kind of other agenda to come one step or two steps or three steps closer to forcing the kind of change. Ulrike Meinhof is, by all accounts, was a violent revolutionary in Germany. And I actually wrote down a quote from her that I'm obsessed with. Protest is when I say this does not please me. Resistance is when I ensure that what does not please me occurs no more. Right? So you've crossed that line between protest and resistance if you're involved in a group like the Earth Liberation Front or the Animal Liberation Front. You're not simply protesting, you're actually trying to force change. You're tired of asking people who are not listening and who are not responsive for the change. You feel the change is desperate and you're willing to push hard and take personal sacrifices like risking prison, like being labeled a terrorist. You've decided to accept those consequences as part of, being engaged in a larger movement that fights harder and potentially has more to win. The fourth point?
Let's skip the fourth one for now, because I think it speaks to a lot of broader issues.
Okay.
The future of the movement in question. We'll hit that, I think, through a number of other questions.
This is the Final Straw Radio. You're hearing a discussion about radical ecological action and property destruction between author and sociologist Rik Scarce and former press officer of the North American Earth Liberation Front Press Office and author Leslie James Pickering. This is recorded at Burning Books in Buffalo, New York. Check out more info on that bookstore at burningbooks.com.
So let's talk about a real-world example, the case of Ruby Montoya and Jessica Resnicek. I hope you know enough to at least have some discussion on this point. I'll give you a little bit of information. In the Earth First Journal, there's an interview done with them just now. On July 24th, they held a press conference in which they read a prepared statement while standing in front of the Iowa Utility Board. In the statement, they confessed to arson and other acts of sabotage along the Dakota Access Pipeline. And these were systematic, by the way. They did it over a period of, I believe, a couple of months. And it was a series of events. It wasn't just one or two. It was actually almost on a daily basis that they went and engaged in these acts. They stopped when they ultimately discovered oil in the pipeline and reached that point and then moved into a different direction. After they made this essentially confession to arson and other acts of sabotage, they then took a crowbar and hammer and began pulling off the letters of the Iowa Utilities Board signed before being arrested. They were released from jail the next day and charged with fourth-degree criminal mischief for damaging the sign. When asked what they wanted people to know about their actions, one of the things that they said is, "We did this out of necessity and in response to a true calling from our hearts. We are in a dire situation with this climate spinning into chaos because of these corporations and the federal government that allows them to lead us further into the unknown as far as climate change is concerned. Anyone that's aware of this needs to be doing, I feel, everything that they can to prevent this downturn that we're in as far as polluting our home." So I wanted to see if you have a reaction to that.
How much time are they looking at?
Well, I mean, I would guess that based on, depending on how many of the individual events that they could actually be charged with, close to life, I would guess,
Yeah.
if all of them were added up.
Yeah. I'd like to think they could be out there and in public, educating people and getting more and more people out there not doing what they chose to do, but doing what so many hundreds did along that pipeline route in terms of blockading it and forcing a really serious discussion about whether we needed that oil and our responsibilities to the planet and things like that, versus, oh my gosh, there go the eco-terrorists again. I hope I made it really, really clear. I think our property-oriented ideology and virtually every other aspect of American ideology is severely out of line with what is right and good and proper for the vast, vast, vast majority of people and for the planet. But I don't think that systematic destruction of a pipeline versus systematic engagement and education and above board, in-your-face activism of the sort represented by civil disobedience, I don't think that the destructive approach is going to get us anything. The pipeline was, I know, unfortunately, only what I know about their case from reading a little bit of it on a couple of links several months ago. There's massive money behind that pipeline. The pipeline is going to be rebuilt. Vail Ski Resort, the extension of it into lynx habitat, $50 million of damage, and it was rebuilt. Millions of dollars to an arson fire in San Diego years ago. Right? Millions of dollars to these condos that were being constructed. They're reconstructed. Animal lab after animal lab attacked, and the experiments are redone. Ironically, the case that I went to jail for, I don't believe those were, but I don't know for sure. So, but twice the number of trees being cut, right, to put the timber back in these cases. Twice the number of animals being tortured. No one, in the case that I went to jail for, no one in Pullman, Washington had ever carried a picket sign in front of any of the animal experimentation laboratories at Washington State University. No one had ever tried to get their neighbors together to do a sit-in there. No one had ever done anything to try to educate the population. The break-in took place, and in the complete vacuum of information regarding the alternative, the authorities had a field day, and theirs was the only story that got told. And I think people probably react the same way.
Yeah, I mean, theirs is an interesting case. I mean, they haven't actually been charged with any of those, even though they admitted to them. And part of the reason that they suspect is because they were the least likely suspects, and the FBI is actually scrambling now, not knowing what to do with that. And you know, that was part of the reason why they came forward. What they said was they wanted to personalize this. They wanted to make it about them, rather than simply having a nameless, faceless someone who actually took off, went underground, whatever. They wanted it to be about them so that they could actually put a face to this. But they also inevitably will probably try and invoke a necessity defense, right? And say that this was an urgent situation that required an immediate response.
Lots of luck with that, right?
Yeah.
The necessity defense never applies. But I'm sorry, and you made a great point, Dave, right? So it's a hybrid.
Yeah, right.
Here they are giving it, and I apologize for going right past that. That's fascinating.
And the one last thing about that is that they actually, when asked who their influences were, they referred to a whole series of civil disobedience actions, right? The Plowshares movement, the Catholic, a whole variety of different Catholic activists as their motivation. And I think, you know, certainly from the way that they speak of it, they don't see it as violent, but they also don't see it as anything really that's fundamentally different from civil disobedience. So, Leslie, did you want to?
Yeah, I do want to point out, well, Vail is a good example, the Vail Ski Resort arson, which is a famous act that the Earth Liberation Front committed. In that case, there was an awful lot of protest first, which I'm assuming you're familiar with. Years of protest leading up, trying to stop the expansion of what was already the biggest ski resort in North America prior to the expansion. And they also had a lot of legal efforts. I actually sat on a panel at a conference with a bunch of, I watched a panel at a conference back then with a bunch of people who worked on the lawsuits that ultimately failed to stop the expansion. And with the Earth Liberation Front, there are a lot, I would say a lot of actions that happened around issues that have been protested locally. And that was sort of seen as like the best way to go. It wasn't always the case, because it's an autonomous movement, it's horizontally organized, who knows who's going to do what, when, and where. And that was one of the things that was challenging about being a spokesperson, so to speak, for the group, is that you never know what communique is going to come in. One time we got a communique claiming responsibility for an earthquake, and it was just like, what, you know? And so it was like, you never kind of knew what, you know, how, I had to do background research on all the actions before we went to the press, because I may not know what's going on in some state across the country, and I needed to know if I was going to be interviewed for it. We also needed to make sure that the arsons had happened before we went to the press, so we had a whole apparatus for figuring that stuff out. But most of the time, the actions actually were around issues that were protested locally. Sometimes lawsuits were filed locally, and that's not to say that all of the people who protested it were going to be in favor of the sabotage of the arson afterwards. But it is to say that the Earth Liberation Front did not see itself, and I think I can say this across the board for radical groups, maybe with accepting some specific strains of leftism, but like, in general, radical groups don't see what they're doing as the fix-all. It's a common myth that, you know, when you see somebody doing something that is more radical and then challenges you, you get defensive and you think, oh, what they think is doing is perfect. Nobody says, like, oh, what the Sierra Club thinks is doing is going to fix the whole problem. Because they're not really challenging you, and they're not putting you in that defensive space. But when a group starts burning down multi-million-dollar buildings, you think, oh, they think they know the whole answer, and that they're going to fix the whole problem with this one thing. But it wasn't that way, and I've never really seen it historically be that way. Most of the time, people have ideas about what radicals are like, and that they're unreasonable, and that they think they know the only way to fix things. But every time I've looked at and studied movements, including being involved in them, it's always been a matter of, we are a part of a bigger movement. We're not going to tell people not to do education anymore. We're not going to tell people not to do civil disobedience anymore. I may or may not keep doing civil disobedience while I'm doing direct action, but you know, I think this is exciting that we're doing sabotage or some kind of radical action, but and it's powerful in a way that I've never seen before, but nobody ever thinks it's going to fix everything all at once. It would be totally irrational. So the whole concept of like coming in and just doing one thing in the middle of the night is going to solve the problem is really never the idea at all. And these buildings, you know, they do have insurance policies, and they do get rebuilt. Which kind of brings me to back to the point of the bigger idea of these radical direct action movements, are that they're really not trying to fix things here and fix things there on a case-by-case basis. They're doing actions where they can to build a movement that is hopefully someday potentially going to be strong enough to bring about what it is that we want to do. If we wait till the very last minute to use our last resort, we're saying, okay, we're going to defend ourselves if and when it really comes down to it. Environmentally, that's a whole other question, because what's left at that point? There's nothing left to the earth to defend at that point. But aside from environmentally, if you wait till the last minute, guess what? You're not going to be prepared. You have to build an apparatus. You have to build all the networks to create a movement that is actually fighting, which most of that, like 90-some% of it, isn't actually fighting. It's part of a bigger community of people working together to build a really effective resistance movement. And if you wait until the last minute to figure out where the safe houses are, figure out how you can get money, figure out if literature is illegal, how you're going to get that through and how you're going to get your message across, guess what? You're not going to be able to do it. We need to start building communities that are capable of implementing things like that through this civil society that we're talking about, right? Through what we're doing here, right here tonight, by having discussions and surrounded by books and ideas and thinking about those in our private lives and then developing those ideas. Interestingly, one thing I didn't get to touch on earlier is that, this idea of having a civil society where people can exchange ideas and hopefully we can progress in a positive direction for social change because we're able to talk and communicate. I'm sure most of us, if not all of us here, are familiar with the 2-year FBI investigation into this bookstore. When shortly after we opened up this bookstore, the FBI launched a 2-year eco-terrorism conspiracy investigation trying to say that this bookstore was a front to form an eco-terrorist cell, right? They put a lot of money into it. They had 2 informants. I'd give presentations all over the place on this thing. And what that really is, it's 2 things. First, it's a frame-up attempt because they knew it wasn't true, right? But what in a bigger sense, what it is an attempt to disrupt the civil society that we're creating here, the space that we have in order to talk about these ideas and work with each other and build a community that's strong. What they want is a divided and conquered community where the people who are more on the peaceful side think the radicals are horrible, and the radicals think the people on the peaceful side are naive and useless. And that's not effective either way. What we need is a community that's together, and that while I don't find it worth my time to do what the other person is doing, I recognize the value of what they're doing, and together maybe we all can create the type of movement in society that actually has a chance to progress.
This is the Final Straw Radio. You're hearing a discussion about radical ecological action and property destruction between author and sociologist Rik Scarce and former press officer of the North American Earth Liberation Front press office and author Leslie James Pickering. This is recorded at Burning Books in Buffalo, New York. Check out more info on that bookstore at burningbooks.com.
And so this leads me to my last question, and then we'll open it up to everyone. I'm wondering if, from your perspective, are we simply dealing with a divide here between reform versus revolution? Is there agreement about the fact that the system, the structure itself, needs to be replaced, or is reform a solution here? If it's the first, if we're talking about revolutionary change, Ward Churchill has said, with regard specifically to pacifist praxis, and he would include nonviolent civil disobedience in that it's a self-defeating strategy because it renders those who engage in it perpetually ineffectual, in which case they're largely ignored by the status quo, or ultimately they make themselves a danger to the state through their actions in a way that they become eliminated without any kind of reaction because they're not willing to use force of any sort to respond to that. So it's a 2-part question. Are we talking about revolution or reform? And if it is revolution, can nonviolent civil disobedience be a strategy that brings about that kind of a change?
I think we're talking about revolution. Yeah, absolutely. And I don't buy what Churchill said there at all. the notion that more hundreds and more thousands getting involved in a movement is somehow or another a sign of ineffectuality, it defies evidence. The more and more people, the greater the number of people who are involved in a movement, the greater the movement's strength. So my argument would be the strength is in numbers. The strength is not in your firepower. I think the firepower begets more firepower coming back at it, and is quite often ineffectual. The long game, what does it all look like at the end given some hypothetical confrontation between the people and those in power? That's going to depend on the number of people, regardless of whether the people have decided to take up arms or not. And I would much rather, as I kind of alluded to before, I would much rather be a part of a movement that is living its ideals and living to, at every step, the utopia that it attempts, the e-utopia. It's a word my professor once used, in Jim Dater at the University of Hawaii. A utopia is an unrealizable ideal future, and e-utopia is a realizable one. So you just put the letter E in front of utopia. I don't know what magic happens with the letter E there, but Jim said it, and I like Jim a lot, so I'm going to let Jim say it. So we're talking about an e-utopia, and I would like for us to embody in all of our practices the e-utopia that we are trying to realize. I think it's going to be awfully difficult to walk back destruction and the underlying potential to go as far as violence if we have if that has been a central part of the revolution that we're talking about trying to create.
I would say that reform, well, the environmental question is a good one to look at, because reform for the environment is a really good thing. Okay? If we could get some good protections in for the environment at this point, or actually at this point, if we could stop the totally inadequate protections that we have had for decades from being eliminated by the current administration, that would be a positive thing, sadly, for us. And when you look at movements, revolutionary movements, you see that they don't throw reform out, right? It doesn't make sense to say, well, to say if the system is changing towards the way that you want it to go, that's not good. The Black Panther Party is a great example. They had several programs, of course, much less known than the violent confrontations they had with the police, right, which we were addressing here, but well known within Black communities and well known within the left community is that the Black Panther Party had extensive what they called survival programs, survival pending revolution programs. They gave away free shoes, they gave away breakfast for children. All the poor kids in the community would come and get breakfast from the Panthers before going to school. Thousands across the country, because the Panthers thought you can't learn anything if you're starving in the morning. And so they opened the first free health clinics in this country. And those breakfast programs are the ones that coerced, more or less the schools to have breakfast or lunch programs and stuff for low-income kids. So it's when you look at revolutionary groups, they're not trying to bring about change now, and it's this concept of survival pending revolution, realizing that revolution is kind of a pie-in-the-sky utopianist idea of having this perfect world afterwards. You need to keep the people fed, you need to protect the animals that are here now, the environments that are here now that are threatened now, even if your ultimate goal is to get rid of the system, to get rid of capitalism, get rid of property ownership and all these things. In the meantime, there are real consequences happening to real people. So that's another myth about radicals and about revolutionaries that I'd like to sort of make a point on, is that they're not throwing all of it away for the sake of this one idea. this concept is, while fighting for the world that we want to live in, for this bigger idea, you're hopefully making gains along the way as well, because these are real things that we actually really care about. We're not just fixated on this idea of what the perfect world would be afterwards. We're fixated on all these problems along the way, which has spurred us to become interested in like changing society. Reluctantly spurred people like me into become interested in like how can we accomplish this seemingly impossible thing of changing all of society so that it actually benefits all of us, and the mountains and the rivers and the animals as well. So that's a big concept for me when it comes to reform versus revolution.
So a number of books that we've referenced tonight are here. Pacifism as Pathology, the communiques of the Earth Liberation Front, penned by Leslie Pickering and Craig Rosenbrough. Constructing Ecoterrorism is one that deals specifically with these topics in a variety of different ways. My personal favorite on the issues of animal rights and the Radical Earth Movement, Total Liberation by David Pellow. But there are many, many others all over the place. David Foreman's Confessions of an Eco-Warrior. There's a book right behind me on the terrorization of dissent. Unfortunately, the bookstore is sold out on the fantastic Eco-Warriors, so that one you'll have to get on a mailing list, I think, in order to solve that problem. But let's open it up to questions.
I do.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I do have one point I was hoping to make. One thing that I noticed when doing this press work for the ELF was that, against even my own predictions, the movement really grew fast with a totally new, totally different kind of person when these actions were happening. And I want to point it out because a lot of these types of discussions are really class-based and really based on these privileges that we never question in society. I did this interview when If a Tree Falls came out for Art Voice, rest in peace. And one of the points I concluded on is that it does not matter, that it won't matter at all how comfortable we are with violence or property destruction when the planet's dead, right? And we have these things about how comfortable we are with our movement or how comfortable we are in our actions, and they seem really important to us. But when you stop and look at the big picture, our comfort levels are pretty irrelevant when you're talking about the annihilation of the planet. You're talking about millions and billions of animals being slaughtered and all these other really horrific things. What we're comfortable with in terms of our actions to bring about social change is something we need to think about, but it shouldn't be our ultimate deciding factor on what we do. And when I was doing the press work for the ELF, surprisingly, it seemed like people were flocking to the Pacific Northwest out of nowhere, from every corner of the earth, to join this movement. And all they knew about it was that things were burning and that people were calling themselves anarchists and dressing in black, and protests were turning into riots. Like, they knew very little, and they were coming out of the woodwork to join. And like Portland, you can look at how much growth happened to Portland, Oregon, and I hate to say that like the movement is a gentrifying force in some of these places that become movement meccas. People just flock there, and it was not the kind of people I was used to seeing in these movements. When it comes to bringing about social change, like, a certain kind of person seems to be attracted to it. No matter what war it is, they're going to be against, they're going to protest it, etc. They're oriented towards like wanting to go out in the street, or wanting to sign petitions, or wanting to organize, or wanting to do the kind of work that the movement is tend to be known for doing, organizing work. But what I saw with the radical environmental movement is that there was a different kind of person that never really came out of the woodwork when the idea was that we were going to protest, or we were going to do petitions and hold signs and write letters. I saw people energized and excited by the fact that this movement was fighting in a more direct and more destructive way. And I wouldn't want to make it seem as though I would discredit that. I think that there's a big place for people who may not be inspired by conversations so much, or by signing petitions, etc., but might be inspired by something like Vail Ski Resort burning down, right? And they seem like they just came out of the woodwork. And a lot of times I think we base this assumption on like, well, this is what social change is, and everybody's going to be uncomfortable with it. No. there were a lot of people who were not only comfortable with sabotage and destruction, but were inspired by it and wouldn't have joined the movement otherwise. These are the same people who, like to watch like monster trucks driving over cars or who knows what, but this is a massive section of American society. Like, why is it that all of our, like so many of our relatives don't want to join the movement? One quick story, right? I've got a side of the family that I'm not very close with. They tease you a lot and they're just kind of gruff and, whatever. And I wasn't, I never really took to them because they just seemed so gruff and like aggressive and unfriendly. And they never understood my politics. I was always a sissy or whatever, and they had all these terms and I just kind of avoided them forever. And it wasn't until the film If a Tree Falls came out, which I'm featured in, that all of a sudden they got it. All this time of like me even knowing that I got arrested on the Washington Monument hanging a banner off it wasn't doing it for them, right? But as soon as they saw me in a movie where things were burning down and I was like rah rah rah, they were like, oh yeah, now we know. We knew it was in you all along. Like it was funny, but that's like a lot of America, right? It really is. There's all kinds of people out there who it's not that they disagree with us, it's that they think we're wasting our time. If they see us doing something that they think makes sense, well, then they might join us. It's not that they hate the environment necessarily and they don't want to join us. It's that they think that we're ridiculous and we're wasting our time. And so I think there needs to be a place for those people in the movement. I'm not saying that all the liberals are wasting their time, but I think there needs to be a place in the movement for people who want to engage in a different way besides comfortable, peaceful protest.
Just a couple of points/questions. One of which is the question for me of violence versus self-defense. I don't personally consider self-defense to be violent. Protecting myself from being attacked and having to smash someone's nose, I don't consider that violent. So I guess for me, where is that then extended as far as the earth or my neighborhood or whatever you want to use to construct there? For example, we're looking at ecological annihilation and the possible end of life support systems that we all rely on as just one species on this planet. Where does self-defense stop when you're thinking of it that way? That's just one piece. As a campaigner, someone who's been campaigning forever, well over 20 years, what does it mean to build a strategy in a campaign? You have goals, you have objectives, you have strategies, and you have tactics. The tactics don't feed the strategy feeds the tactic. If you're trying to stop a corporation, like you're talking about, from doing XYZ, then you're looking at what the corporation is going to be most vulnerable to, and you figure out your tactics accordingly. Is it going to be a very public civil disobedience with people getting arrested and going through the whole courtroom drama and going through the press a lot and making them look bad? Or is it going to be a direct blockade of the entrances and literally shutting down the buildings for as long as it takes, occupying and shutting it down for as long as it takes? Or is it going to be something else? Or will it be someone throwing something into the building that will literally shut it down for a long time? These are questions that are built into the campaign, not floating by themselves. They require a bigger question of goals and strategy.
So let me take that first piece on an eco-terrorist by these definitions, or by the government's definition, an animal liberation activist who was actually jailed for releasing 2,000 minks from a fur farm. I bring up this specific example. He wrote an op-ed piece in yesterday's Guardian. It's a fantastic discussion of all of these issues very directly, and so I urge you to take a look at that. So he released 2,000 minks from a fur farm, which is that sacred cow or sacred mink of property. And he said, and I quote, "I am a terrorist not because of what I did, but because the government dislikes why I did it. When the distinguishing feature of a terrorist is simply an ethical concern for animals, such concerns become marginalized, and voicing them becomes dangerous. What remains is silence." So he ultimately is branded a terrorist, very much as you described. So he is that characteristic. You could argue it was a movement leader in a number of ways, and was in jail for, I believe, maybe 5 years. I don't remember what the number was exactly, but he had an enhanced terrorism enhancement to it, the AETA, the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, which protects pharmaceutical industries and basically farm business. Ultimately has lobbied for this, and it was added on to his sentence, and so he is labeled a terrorist. It's a fantastic read, and I think it ties directly into this, so I'd urge you all to take a look at that. But it also brings us to a question that I want to just clarify before we move on with the discussion. Let's get the concept of these terms really clear so that there isn't any ambiguity. When we talk about, but let's use the term violence first of all. What would you characterize as violence?
It's not a term, I don't believe I used the V word at all when I spoke.
You did not, no, yeah.
Okay. Real quickly, violent was what was the label that was being used when I wrote Eco Warriors. Violent was the label that went on property destruction oriented activists. So violent was the terrorism of its day, or terrorist of its day. Okay. Then with 9/11, we got this awful willy-nilly use of the word terrorism wholesale, although clearly the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act predated 9/11. To my mind, this is what the way I wrote it in Eco Warriors. It was something along these lines. Violence is harm done to human beings, right? And by the same token, terrorism is the same. They are not synonymous. But that's was my understanding in eco, and I like that.
Okay, great. Leslie?
When I use the term violent, I'm talking about violent, physical violent harm towards human beings. I'm not really including property destruction.
Okay.
My terminology.
So property destruction, sabotage, direct action, are they? Can we use those synonymously, or are you thinking of those as having different connotations?
I think some of those are more specific than others, but under the big umbrella of property destruction, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
same.
Same.
And if we add arson into that, does it change the equation?
It's a form of property destruction.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So the concept or the term "by any means necessary," if we put that in the context of a liberatory, ecological, or animal movement, what would that mean to you? Where would you draw a line of what any means necessary would mean?
It means no holds barred.
Yeah.
All the way to killing human beings.
And so then the second half of that is it an acceptable basis of thinking about this struggle?
It's not from my point of view, right? Let me clarify one thing too, real quickly. Something I said may have caused a misunderstanding on a really, really important point. The civil disobedience-oriented activists who I have in mind have exactly the same ends in mind as those who commit acts of property destruction. Right? They are not reformist. I want to be clear. You mentioned reformism a couple times, and I wanted to be clear that the activists who I'm speaking about do not have as an end goal reforming our current political, economic, and other systems. They want to see wholesale change.
Okay. Leslie, to you, by any means necessary?
I was after I got this award at the Western New York Peace Center dinner, and for Activist of the Year or something like this. Funny, I don't usually get stuff like that. And the keynote speaker was from Amnesty International. The keynote speaker heard I was going to get the award and actually canceled being the keynote speaker because they didn't want to share a stage with a terrorist, much to what you're saying here. Yeah. And so there was this drama that unfolded locally here in Buffalo around that, and so I ended up going to. I think that's very shameful for Amnesty International. And I wanted to expose it, so I ended up going to all these private meetings with the Western New York Peace Center, trying to convince them to give me their blessing to go public, which I actually did. Amazingly, was able to do that, crowning jewel of my life. Thing was, at the end of like a way too long discussion that went way too late into the night, one person from the Peace Center was like, "Okay, Leslie, we totally hear what you're saying, and we're going to talk about what you're proposing once you leave. But before you go, I want you to talk about one thing. 50 years ago, Malcolm X used this term, by any means necessary. And it's been bothering me ever since for the last half century. Can you tell me what he's meaning? Can you defend that? And I was, my initial response was, well, if I answer that question, isn't it going to tarnish like your vote on whether I can go public with this completely unrelated issue about Amnesty International throwing radicals under the bus? You sure you want me to answer that question? And they had a little go around. They said, yeah, we want you to answer the question anyway. And so I did, and the way that I answered it is pretty much the way I would answer it now, which is that the most important aspect of that phrase, which is also probably the most overlooked aspect, is the word necessary. In every struggle, there are two sides. In every political struggle, there are two sides, the oppressor and the oppressed. And it is always, 100% of the time, the oppressor who decides how hard the oppressed have to fight in order to gain their liberation. So when someone like Malcolm says, by any means necessary, he's really pointing the responsibility back to the oppressor. It's the oppressor who decides how hard we need to fight. If they would have said, you know what, you can have the vote, by signing petitions and holding signs, then that would have been that. If they would have said, you will end slavery, or we'll give, another thing that we've been fighting for forever, because you've protested and you've done a bunch of civil disobedience, well, then that would have been that, but they don't. And I did 24 acts of civil disobedience before I stopped doing it. And before that, I protested and signed petitions and wrote letters, and I still do all of that stuff. I don't do civil disobedience right now, but I think maybe when I get older, I might do it again. I don't know. But the thing is, it's the oppressor who decides what's necessary. And so when I hear the term by any means necessary, it really makes me think, who's deciding what is necessary here? It's not us. We're at the disadvantaged. We are the oppressed. We are the ones who, what we want is freedom. We're trying everything nice, then we're trying everything that's not quite so nice, then we're trying everything that's kind of middle of the road, and as time goes on and the decades pass, we try more and more stuff because they're just not budging by being nice. So what does it mean in terms of violence? It's up to them. Right. It's up to the oppressor. It's always up to the oppressor in every struggle. We obviously don't want to. If we wanted to kill people, you would have seen, the first environmentalists out killing people. But you don't see that, right? Because it's not what we want, because it's actually the opposite of what we stand for. But they're pushing us harder and harder to fight harder and harder, and it's really on the oppressor. What do we have to do is my question. What is necessary? We're trying to figure that out.
So earlier today, Rik spoke at Niagara University, and his talk was a slightly different topic, but related, on incivility in civil society and the ecological resistance movements as being a potentially incivil approach to getting a response within public or quasi-public spaces that we think of as civil society. It was a really interesting discussion and highlighted the importance of creating these spaces, managing these spaces, taking advantage of them in a variety of different ways. But one of the issues that didn't come up is exactly what Leslie was just alluding to. What if those spaces shrink as a result of government forces? And government explicitly tries to eliminate those spaces by criminalizing the actions that might take place within civil society. And in particular, protest, obviously civil disobedience, but even lesser scale sorts of demonstrations. And in particular, if those police not only criminalize those acts, but use violence to stop them, use violence against the protesters, what then?
Do we fight violence with violence? How many people are you going to win over if you do that? Who's going to look good? Who's going to look right? We've got agency here. The oppressor doesn't entirely call the shots. We have to interpret the alternatives. And the beauty of, a big part of the beauty of an anarchist world, those of the past and the ones that many of us envision for the for the future is an extraordinary amount of freedom. We need to capture today that freedom in our lives to make incredibly difficult decisions regarding how we respond to oppression. I'm hesitant to get into a lot of hypotheticals. I definitely, Gandhi said that the only thing worse than violence was cowardice. There is a point when the oppression gets so horrific, right, and hopefully it's well short of so horrific, that, yeah, some pretty awful things have to go back at the oppressor. We are not remotely there. What kind of future are we creating as well if we do take up that kind of, those kinds of tactics? I worry about that. Are our tactics reflecting, and I don't mean to get us off this point, no. I hope I'm reflecting it. Are our tactics reflecting the future that we want, or the past and the current that's being forced upon us?
So let me bounce off of that, because Leslie, I think you already answered that indirectly with your. But do you want to add anything else to that before I?
I don't like violence. I don't like destruction. I mean, to be honest, there's a part of me that likes some destruction. To be fully honest, like there's a part of me that, like, when I see something, say the police, that is just so systematically attacking all of our movements for change and stopping so much progress. And then if I see a police station trashed or something, it's like that, it brings a smile to my face. But in general, like destruction, for the sake of destruction isn't something that I like. Even property destruction isn't necessarily something that I like, there's context to it, and this is the context that I like when I do like it. And when it comes to violence, I really don't like violence at all. It's not something that gets me going in terms of physical violence against people. Again, I feel like it's something that you resort to in extreme circumstances, and it all depends on your analysis of the circumstances about whether that is extreme enough. I mean, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but it's like millions of animals that die every day. If you're talking about the animal rights movement in slaughterhouses and other places of abuse and neglect across the country. And I don't think I need to go into what we're looking at during my daughter's lifetime in terms of the environment. It's just unacceptable. And we have leadership that is not taking us in a positive direction. So it really makes you think, what needs to be done? How much are we willing to sacrifice? And you look to all these people on the shelves here, and like a lot of them sacrificed a lot. And if it weren't for what they sacrificed, where would we be now? It's really hard to say. But I'm convinced that all of the sacrifices, be it jail time, sacrificing your life, or anything lesser, helped shape the good stuff that we still do have here now, by all these people that we know and all these people we don't know. So I think I'm veering off track a little bit.
No.
In terms of the kind of future that we create and reflecting what we want in the society by our actions now, I actually feel that one of the things that's really, really important in society that's lacking is a population that responds adequately to problems, that isn't complacent, isn't apathetic, and that when something happens, we don't just put it into the hands of elected officials or authorities, but we take it into our own hands to some extent. Certainly a much greater extent than what Americans do now. We see problems across the world, we see problems in our communities and in our nation, and we always just toss it up to the people in charge to fix these problems, even though they never, ever do a good job, right? And so I think it's important that one of the things that I want to see in the future that I would like to create or help create is everybody engaging each other. There being some kind of responsibility towards other citizens and other people in your community, and the mountains and the rivers and the animals too, where if something is going to go wrong, that you step up. I mean, it's kind of the basis of the Antifa movement right now, that if you see something that's going wrong in terms of the fascist buildup that's happening in this country right now, that movement actually steps up and says, you know what, we know the police aren't going to deal with this. We know the FBI are going to deal with it the same way they dealt with the Klan in the 60s, which is by basically ignoring them and letting them do their thing. So we're going to realize that reality and step into that space and physically confront these people. And it's not nice, but what happens when you let that kind of thing go unchecked? It's not good. You can look at it historically. It's not. So part of the future I want to create is people who are willing to say, you know what, I'll give up my future potentially to fight this environmental destruction.
You just heard a chat between sociologist and author Rik Scarce and author and former press officer for the North American Earth Liberation Front Press Office, Leslie James Pickering, which was recorded in 2017 at Burning Books in Buffalo, New York. You can find more presentations from Burning Books at our website and learn more about their bookstore, including books by Pickering and Scarce at burningbooks.com. And you can hear an interview that we did with Pickering about surveillance through the mail and freedom of information requests that he did to check out government spying on him at our website. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw Radio, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned co-op in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a catalog of Firestorm's books and zines, plus a full calendar of events up at their website, firestorm.coop.